So I want to start with you, Dana. Dana Beasley Brown. Dana's a working class mother who lives in Bowling Green, and you said you grew up in dire poverty. She's also a beneficiary of Obamacare, and she's worried about losing her coverage. Dana, what question do you want to ask the two of the individuals?
I have heard the question often from folks who come from other parts of the country, or why do the white working class vote against their own interest? But that is not an informed question. The reality is that in Kentucky there's only one narrative, and the Republicans own that narrative, and the Democrats have been complicit in holding up that narrative of everything government is bad and destructive and will harm people, and the private sector and privatizing everything is going to solve all of our problems. And my question to you all is, how are the Democrats, how are you going to, or why do you expect regular Kentuckians to vote for Democrats when the vision has not been given, and the solutions that are really going to help working class families when the candidates aren't even willing to bring it up?
Well, Dana, thank you for that extraordinary question. Like, you cut through a whole lot of stuff. And as an independent who ran for the Democratic nomination, what I have tried to do is to do my best to make it clear and to try to force the situation where the Democratic Party does stand very forcefully for the needs of working families, and at the same time, and this is where it is hard, have the guts to take on the big money interests who have so much influence over the economic and political life of this country. In my view, you can't say, I am for this, I'm for that, and I'm for this. Oh, but by the way, I'm really not going to take on Wall Street, and I'm not going to take on the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm not going to take on the insurance companies, and I'm not going to take on the fossil fuel industry, but I'm for all of these good things. I'm not going to ask the billionaire class to start paying their fair share of taxes. You got to stand for something. And in my view, the cutting edge of this moment, not everybody agrees with me for sure, I believe we're moving toward an oligarchic form of society. And what that means is that we're looking at a small number of billionaires who are controlling our economy and our political life. And by the way, here in Kentucky, one of the leaders of that effort is Senator Mitch McConnell. He thinks, by the way, that Citizens United, which allows billionaires to spend unlimited sums of money in political campaigns, did not go far enough. He wants to eliminate all campaign finance regulations. So to answer your excellent question, I think you're right. I think the Democratic Party has got to once again, as it was in the 30s and 40s, become the party of the working class of this country, a working class which is shrinking, and have the guts to take on big money interests.
Dana, I think we are at our best as a party when we lead with our values. I had the privilege of working for a guy named Ted Kennedy in the United States Senate a while back. And he talked about, the vision of the Democratic Party is the vision of a party that's working for the economic security of the common man and the common woman, making sure that you have the tools to succeed, to become self-sufficient, making sure that regardless of where you live, regardless of your race, regardless of who you worship, regardless of who you love, you have access to this table of opportunity that is the American table. And when we're leading clearly with our values, I think we succeed. Dana and I were talking before we started today, and the Affordable Care Act is about enabling the residents of Kentucky to become self-sufficient. For Dana, the Affordable Care Act has been a lifesaver. For Ward, the long-haul truck driver I met in Nashville, Tennessee, he got his coverage March the 1st, 2015. He had his liver transplant 3 weeks later. And I asked him, Ward, you're getting your health back. What are you going to do? He said, I want to work. I want to be a taxpayer. And so I don't understand for the life of me how your two senators have been leading the charge to repeal it. Anybody who's been touched by the opioid epidemic, how can you possibly contemplate the repeal of the Affordable Care Act? Is it perfect? No. Has it enabled people to become self-sufficient? Absolutely. And when we lead with our values, and articulate our message, that's when I think we do well. And I accept your question as a call to action for the Democratic Party to make sure we communicate our values, because I think our values of access to opportunity, they resonate everywhere. They resonate to that coal miner. And I've spent time in eastern Kentucky talking to coal miners. And that message of economic opportunity, we're going to invest in your skills, because I don't know that I can look you in the eye and say your coal job is going to be here forever. But what I can do is look you in the eye and say, we're going to fight for you so that you will have the skills to punch your ticket to the middle class for your entire working life. That's what we do best as Democrats.
I wanted to pick up on something the senator said about Citizens United. That came up in a few of our conversations. Tyler, I think you talked a lot about your concern about money in politics. Who else was concerned about that? Others too? I think Wesley mentioned it. But Tyler, do you want to say a little bit about it?
It's a major concern, the transparency with politicians is you don't really know who's pulling their strings. So my question is, how do we get big money out of politics? How do we know that our campaigns are on the up and up and that our candidates are on the up and up, not having somebody behind the strings pull in for their special interest or in their special direction?
Well, Tyler, you're generous when you use the word pulled. You might want to use the word owned. It would be maybe a more Look, here's what you got. Campaign financing is not a sexy issue. Healthcare, education, environment, women's rights, there's the easier issues for people to understand. But if you're concerned about any of those issues, you have to be concerned about the kinds of money that candidates get in order to get elected. All right? Citizens United was passed by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision. Okay? And what it says, if you are a billionaire, or you're the Koch brothers worth $80 billion, you can pour hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, endless amounts of money into the political process. You want to become governor of Kentucky? Yeah, I'm going to write you out a check for $50 million. Now, who do you think you're going to be representing? You think you're going to be representing the working people of the state, or are you going to represent my interest? All right? By the way, Mitch McConnell wants to go further. He thinks Citizens United did not go far enough because that allows for independent expenditures. He wants the Koch brothers to be able to directly fund candidates. All right? So the question is, they will argue, they say, is this is a First Amendment right. Hey, if I'm a billionaire and I want to buy you, why should you deny me? That's my constitutional right. I don't believe that. But this is an important issue. What do you guys think of? Tom, you wanted to jump in, but
I mean, let me be honest with you, Tyler. It just got harder to tackle this issue about a week ago because we now have a 9-court complement on the Supreme Court as a result of, frankly, what Leader McConnell did a year ago when Justice Scalia died. He successfully postponed the vote on Merrick Garland, and he succeeded. I have to acknowledge that he succeeded, and I have no doubt in my mind that Justice Gorsuch is Scalia clone, and so if we're looking to the Supreme Court for help on this, we're in all likelihood looking at the wrong place, and that's why we need to have folks like you rising up from the grassroots. Let me give you one small example of how this has just gotten worse, and it just happened last week again. You know, the White House under the Obama administration used to release our logs of all the people who came in to the White House, with a few exceptions for national security, if there was a national security issue. But coming in to lobby about, your Wall Street interests, that's not national security. So we released these. Well, they announced last week that they're not going to release any of the logs of people who are coming into the White House. I don't get that. That's a first cousin of your question. We need more sunshine. We need more transparency, not less. And they said it would be too costly. One trip, literally one trip to Mar-a-Lago, the cost of funding that would fund the database for 13 years. So don't give me this BS about it costs too much to do. We're fighting an uphill battle, and it's got to start in places like Kentucky, where we stand up and demand transparency and accountability, and we're going to need a constitutional amendment, and we've got a tall hill to climb, but with your help, we can start climbing.
we need a constitutional amendment, but we're also seeing communities all over this country who are passing local campaign finance legislation, which says, for example, if you're able to raise a certain amount of small donations to show that you have real grassroots support, then you'll get some public funding. There are ways to get around it. But let me ask you, because thank you for raising that question. You guys are asking great questions, by the way. What do you think? If I'm a billionaire and I want to elect this guy who's going to support my financial interests to be governor of the state or senator or whatever, is that my constitutional right? Should I be able to buy my seat? What do you think? Is that freedom?
No, because then I'm not representing the people.
Right. Other side, you.
I would say it's there definitely needs to be reforms in the area, but I think it's an interesting thing where one does not necessarily always mean the other. As far as just because X amount of people give in to funding my campaign, my election, I'm not always going to answer those people. Yes, that's implicit. You might think
Right.
that, but it's not always.
Well, what about the converse? What happens if a billionaire says, okay, here's $100 million. Do you think you're going to be beholden to the ordinary people of your state or beholden to the guy who gave you that $100 million?
Like I said, you could do both. Like it's likely that sometimes, may not be. And, there is big money, and it's harder for somebody like a me or a Tyler to run for an office without that backing or without that network sometimes. But I don't think necessarily. I do think that it needs to be looked at in reforms, and it's an issue of concern. But I don't think it automatically implies necessarily that.
Senator, can I ask you this too? In this election, we saw a billionaire who actually got elected himself, and his entire platform was, "I'm not bought off by anybody." Are we living in an era in politics where that's going to be what's to be expected?
This is what I worry about. I worry about two things. Number one, increasingly, because of Citizens United, and if Mitch McConnell gets his way, it's going to become even worse. Two things happen. Either the cost of running for office is becoming absolutely prohibitive. Okay, these guys have unlimited sums of money. If you are the Koch brothers, you're worth $80 billion. A few $100 million is pocket change. All right, so you want to run for office? Here's your check for $50 million. So two things happen. Either the opposition becomes billionaires themselves. I don't need any money. I don't have to go to the DNC because I'm a billionaire. All right, well, you want a government just of millionaires and billionaires. I kind of think that's not what America is supposed to be about. Or else, if you're not a billionaire, you're going to be beholden. You're very wealthy. Please help me, and I'll pay attention to your interests. That's what I fear about the future. And that's why I believe we need real campaign finance reform, and I happen to believe in public funding of elections.
What I'm kind of referring to is Miss Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton's campaign is the most funded campaign that we've seen ever. Mm-hmm. And that's from the Democratic side. Mm-hmm. So much less or much more than President Trump's. Sure. And so at that level, she's representing the Democratic Party. Way more money went into backing her campaign. Mm-hmm. So if the Democratic Party votes for her, where's that money coming from too? Does that mean she's going to answer to those people? So it's a tricky thing. The environment.
It's not a tricky thing. I think you raise a good point. It's a fair point.
It's what we operate in right now. So if we're going off big money and everything like that, Hillary Clinton should have won, and she should have been held to those interests for the Democratic Party. And I think that's what I was just trying to do.
What do you say to that?
Well, what I say, two things. It is not true that in every instance the person who has the most money wins. If that were the case, I would not be in the United States Senate. But it is true that in most cases, all right, if I'm going to run against you, let's say we both have the same talents, okay, and I have 10 times more money than you do. Every once in a while, you may beat me. I will beat you most of the time. That's just the simple truth, okay? Not all the time. But the truth is, look, these guys, if you are the Koch brothers, or a billionaire, or on Wall Street, why are you spending that much money? Are you just a nice guy trying to put money into a campaign, or do you think you're going to get something from it? And I think you think you're going to get something from it. So to answer your question, money plays an enormously important role. You gave it an example where it didn't. But in most cases, it actually does.
Grace, I want to bring you into this, too. Grace is a high school student and was very concerned and thinking about how to get more millennials to run for office and more young people engaged. It strikes me as a very relevant and connected issue, because how can millennials run for office if they can't raise that much money and don't have that much money? You want to say a little bit about that, Grace?
Yeah, I find the possibility of buying politicians as direct oppression of people who don't have that money, as direct discrimination against young people and against people who aren't billionaires. And it's really disheartening to be a young person in Kentucky right now, because most of the people who are making the decisions about my future are much, much older than me. And the case is not that that young people are apathetic, because we're not apathetic. There just aren't candidates that support our values, or at least there aren't candidates that are getting funding that support our values. So, you know, how do we make sure that those people get heard? How do we make sure that young people feel motivated to show up to the polls because there are people like them who are running?
Well, Grace, first of all, we need you to run because you're incredibly impressive. I have 3 kids, 20, 18, and 14. So I feel like I have my own daily focus group of millennials. And what I've learned from them and their friends is that you are the most altruistic generation, perhaps in American history. You demand a world in which we address climate change. You demand a workplace in which people are treated with respect, in which workers can make a living, and you wear your values on your sleeve. And what we have to do as a party is not simply give you a seat at the table, but we need to make sure that you're included and actively engaged. I mean, there's an election today in Georgia, and the leading Democrat is 30 years old. And we need to get more folks like you engaged. And that's why as a party, and it's the same thing we were saying before, when we lead with our values, I think our values are your values. We need to make college education a reality for folks. We need to make sure that health care is a right. It's not a privilege. We need to make sure that everyone, everywhere, and if you want to stay home in your community in rural Kentucky, that you have a pathway to the middle class. We want to make sure if you want to move to Louisville, that you have that opportunity. And when we lead with our values, that's what I've learned from my kids. That, Dad, you got to talk more about what you stand for. And so I want to make sure you continue to push for that, because
I want to push on
you're
this.
doing good stuff.
I want to push on this a little bit. Senator, I mean, you said you didn't even use the word millennial, but you were one of the most popular candidates for 18 to 35-year-olds for young people that we've seen, even more than President Obama. What's the action plan? I mean, how do we really activate this generation and get them involved?
Stuff is not quite as complicated as political consultants will tell you. And you sit around here, and I've done these meetings all over this country. You would be amazed at how beautiful the American people are, how decent the American people are. There are exceptions to the rule. Most Americans are not racist, they're not sexist, they're not homophobes, they are decent people. We have differences of opinion, but we all love the country and want to see the country succeed. One of the problems, and I make this point all of the time, is that a lot of people think that getting involved in running for office or getting involved politically, I don't know enough. I don't have a PhD in economics. What do I know about this? What do I know about Serbia? What can I do? Well, you know what? I serve in the United States Senate. Trust me. Guys in the United States Senate don't know it all as well. All right? They're also searching for answers. You know as much. So the first thing you got to do is say, I'm an American citizen. I believe in democracy. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to get involved, because I owe that to the men and women from Vermont and Kentucky who put their lives on the line and sometimes died to defend democracy. All right? Yeah, you can run for office. You're not going to run for president of the United States. Run for school board. You know what? We need great people on school boards. We need great people on city councils. You don't want to run? Good. Support him. Talk to him. Get your group of people together. What do you stand for? Let's start discussing issues. One of the things that drives me crazy is that you have 30-second stupid ads telling everybody how terrible you are, how terrible you are. What do we stand for? What do you want to see? What's going on in Frankfort, Kentucky? What's going on in Burlington, Vermont? How do we improve our society? What are the ideas? Should we make public colleges and universities tuition free? Should we join the rest of the industrialized world and guarantee health care to all people as a right? Should we lower prescription drug costs? Should billionaires start paying their fair share of taxes? Okay, some people agree, some people disagree. Have that discussion. Media does a very poor job in that, okay? And Congress does a poor job. But that's what we need to engage in. And that's maybe what we're doing here today.
The most important currency you all bring to the table is your life experiences and the wisdom that comes with it. And listening to you and looking at your bios, you would bring a tremendous amount to the table, because you don't need a PhD in labor economics. You have a PhD in life. And that is a far more important skill.
Yeah, so one of the barriers to getting involved in Kentucky is actually mass incarceration. And we're one of 4 states right now that permanently disenfranchises folks who have felonies on their records. And they want to be involved, and there are studies that show that recidivism rates go down, you know, when people actually are a part of the political process. So what is the Democratic Party thinking about moving forward in paths for these folks to be able to really be involved?
Absolutely. I mean, as a civil rights lawyer, I've seen this firsthand here in Kentucky and around the country. This is a civil rights issue. When you have done wrong, you have to pay your debt to society, but that debt shouldn't be a lifelong debt that you have to pay. And you look at African American men, and the rate of disenfranchisement is off the charts. And that's why you look in the platform of the Democratic Party, and it calls very unequivocally for action. And where the action needs to take place is here in Frankfurt, in state capitals across this country, because the folks who are most affected are folks who have been in the state systems. That's where the vast majority of people coming in and out of the criminal justice system are coming. And so we have to take action here in Frankfurt. We need a national strategy, but we need a state-by-state approach to that strategy. And as you've correctly pointed out, here in Kentucky, you're one of the worst offenders. Not you, but your leadership is one of the worst offenders. And we've got to put our values forward. And I think one of the values that Kentuckians and folks across this country share is, you know what? Yes, I need to pay my debt to society, but it just shouldn't be a lifelong debt. The punishment should fit the crime, and it doesn't.
Let me just jump in. And by the way, I'm proud to say that in my state of Vermont, that's not the case. I can't remember when, but a decision was made that if you serve your time, you pay your dues to society, you then can participate in the democratic process. And we have to push that, absolutely. But this issue touches on a broader issue, and that is the issue of voter suppression. Okay, this is a huge issue. We talked about a moment ago the power of big money in politics, and people are concerned about that. There is another issue. I've run for office many, many times, and the God's truth is I know the parts of the state where I'm strongest, and I know the parts of my state where I'm weakest. It has never occurred to me for 1 second to say, okay, how do I prevent people from voting? You know, how do I put obstacles in their way because they might vote against me? If I can't win based on my ideas, then I shouldn't win, frankly. But as all of you know, all over this country, you have Republican governors who are working overtime, trying to put all kinds of obstacles in the way of poor people, people of color, older people, and young people from voting. They don't want you to participate. I think this is a major issue, and I think it's an issue that we have got to deal with. They use the word voter fraud. Well, voter fraud is a very serious problem. Anyone who's engaged in voter fraud should be punished severely. It is a minimal issue in America, thank God. But they are trying to keep people from voting who might vote against them. What do you guys think about that?
Tanya, any response?
Yeah, so this has been happening a lot in Kentucky, and we have been working very hard in Frankfurt for many, many years, at least 12 years with the House Bill 70. We've organized around it, and there's certain people that are able to block that process. And so as they sit supposedly representing all of Kentucky, they're not representing all of Kentucky. So we have mobilized and have been at the forefront of that, and it still hasn't made any difference. So we need national people to back us. And where is that?
Count me in.
Okay.
Tanya,
You heard it here.
Tanya, in your view, what is their goal? Do they simply do not want people to be voting
do
who
not
might
want
vote
people to
against
vote.
them?
That's right.
So these people who talk about freedom and democracy, they're afraid that people might vote them out of office.
And as you mentioned, most of them are people of color.
Right. Well, they're young people.
And young people.
Young people.
Well, let me give you one statistic in Texas, because I used to prosecute these cases, and Texas enacted one of the worst voter ID laws in the country. If you had a University of Texas ID card, wasn't good enough, but your concealed carry license was good enough. They didn't want young people to vote, and in our trial that we had, the reason for doing it was there was a rampant problem of voter fraud. And this is their statistics. This isn't Tom's statistics. This is the statistics from the state. Over a 10-year period, 46 million plus votes were cast. There were 0 reported incidents of non-citizen voting and 2 incidents of in-person voter fraud out of 46 million votes cast. So when you hear this told, I mean, we have to live in a world of facts, and it is one of the most unconscionable things I have seen in my experience as a civil rights lawyer going across the country. We need to have a pitched debate about ideas, but we shouldn't make it harder for our perceived foes to vote. That's not who we are as America. And millennials have been helping to lead that charge, and civil rights leaders and faith leaders and others have been helping to lead that charge. And count me in here in Kentucky and elsewhere.
Thank you, Tom. I want to turn to an issue that affects Kentucky, coal miners. So we have Gary Bentley here, who is a coal miner from eastern Kentucky. He and his friends have been particularly hard hit. And he's going to ask a question about what the Democratic Party can really do to help in the long term.
Yeah, and actually some topics have already been brought up and kind of changed the direction of my path. So you talk about disenfranchisement of voters and then big money playing a role in politics and the way people are represented. The region I come from has been dominated by the coal industry for over 150 years. It's been the single industry for the middle class in that region, and that alone controlled the way people in that region vote. And it also prevents them from possibly voting on other issues that they're concerned about, because they're looking at how are we going to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis. And so the question is transitioning and moving towards a more diversified economy, because not only does that give them the economic freedom, it also gives them the freedom to vote on issues without worrying about how that's going to affect their daily lives and how to afford to get by each week.
You know, I spent a lot of time, Gary, in eastern Kentucky when I had the privilege of being labor secretary, and one of my top memories of my job was the privilege of spending time in Pikeville. I went to a company called BitSource. It was a startup in downtown Pikeville. And I met with, at a table like this, a dozen people who had the following in common. They were coal miners. They were generational coal miners. Their dads, their grandpas were coal miners, and they had lost their jobs. BitSource was a startup. Their motto was from coal to code. So they were learning how to code. And there were two people in there whose stories I remember like they were yesterday. One of whom had gotten a call from the coal mine the day before I was there saying, we have a job for you if you want to come back. And he said no, because I have a future, a better future, I believe, in the world of coding. And then another guy who, on his screensaver, he had a photo of his 1 or 2 year old. And I said, who is that? Oh, that's my son. Someday my son's going to tell me I can't do something. And I'm going to look him in the eye and say, son, 7 years ago, I didn't know how to turn on a computer, and now I'm a coder. And what it taught me, as a kid who grew up in Buffalo, New York, watched the steel industry have its heyday and then some down days, is that the people of eastern Kentucky are resilient. And what they need is a government who is there fighting for them. And we invested in those people. We were subsidizing their wage under an investment from the Department of Labor. And why? Because I believed in them. And they're all going gangbusters now. And I don't believe in telling people things that I believe aren't going to be accurate. When I hear Donald Trump say, I'm going to bring your coal jobs back, I just can't in good conscience look those folks in the eye and promise that. Because you got natural gas. You got other forces at work. But what I can promise you here in Kentucky and everywhere is that we're going to be fighting to make sure that you have economic opportunity, whether it's in your community or elsewhere. And that's why we worked with former Governor Beshear and with Republicans and Democrats to create broadband infrastructure in eastern Kentucky, because you can't grow the jobs of tomorrow if you don't have that infrastructure. That's why Senator Sanders, when he talks about free college tuition, we have to recognize the reality of today, which is, in my parents' generation, a 10th grade education or 12th grade education was enough to enable you to punch your ticket to the middle class. Today we need more, not necessarily a 4-year degree, but we need that training in how to code. And we need that hand up. It's not a handout, but it's an opportunity to make you continue to be sufficient and continue to have the dignity of life in eastern Kentucky. It may be a different line of work, but I believe that we lead and we're at our best when we're honest with people. And what I can't understand about President Trump's budget is he's cutting funding for these investments. The Appalachian Commission has been a godsend to that region. And for the life of me, I don't understand how. I understand that some people thought that he would be a change agent, but I don't think that's the kind of change that is going to help the region.
Senator, can I ask you this? As Tom is rightly pointing out, as robots become a thing and jobs get automated, and coal is one of those industries, what is the long-term plan? I mean, how can we help people like Gary and his family?
Well, for a start, in my view, we have to recognize something, and I'd love to hear your views on it. I happen to agree with virtually all of the scientists who studied the issue that climate change is real. That's all. I know not everybody agrees with that, but I think the scientific evidence is overwhelming. I believe that climate change is caused by human activity, the emission of carbon, and I believe that it is already in our country and around the world causing devastating problems. I have 4 kids and I have 7 grandchildren, and I am going to do my best to make sure that future generations are able to live on a planet which is healthy and which is habitable. That's the reality. Now, does that make it the fault of the coal miners? Of course not. When I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, I'll never forget it. You had these huge piles of coal that kept my apartment warm. And thank you to the coal miners who put their lives on the line and died producing that coal. The world is changing. And I'll tell you one of the things we don't do. We don't discard people because we have to, not continue, making coal a major fuel for the future. All right? There is legislation right now, that if we do not act, you're going to see thousands of coal mining families in this state lose their health benefits and lose their pension benefits. And somebody might want to ask the senior senator from Kentucky what he is going to do to pass that legislation. All right? So we don't blame the coal miners because we're trying to protect the planet. These are brave people, and we have to support them in terms of passing legislation to protect their pensions and protect their health benefits. But I would be curious. I mean, I think when I ran for president, what I said is we're not going to forget about people who are in the fossil fuel industry. We're going to put $41 billion into rebuilding those communities. And by the way, there are a lot of jobs available in sustainable energy right now, in solar, in wind, in geothermal. We have to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. Believe me, in Vermont, and I suspect in Kentucky, you got roads, you got bridges, you got water problems, right? Wastewater plants. We can create jobs doing that. Most of the new decent paying jobs that are being created will require higher education. My guess is that in Kentucky as well as in Vermont, many working class families are having a hard time afford college. Should we make public colleges and universities tuition free? I think we should, so that young Americans can get the jobs of the future and not just people in China or India. Those are some of the ideas.
Wesley, I want to bring you into this. You haven't had a chance to weigh in. Wesley's 24 years old. He's in the military. He's been there for several years. What do you think about all this? And feel free to also redirect the conversation toward foreign policy.
Absolutely. I just, with in a dream world for me, like college tuition, free tuition to everybody, it sounds great. It's the sexy thing everybody likes to see. But for me, I the trickle effect of just what comes with that, as far as where that revenue, where the funding sources come from. 1.
Great question.
2, you go into high school. Like if I'm going to high school with Tyler or any of these people here, and I'm like, oh, it's free anyways. What starts that competitiveness for those scholarships, for those opportunities in high school? Because I'm going to be going for free anyway, so it doesn't matter if I get the Regent scholarship.
Because you're in the military.
Well, no, I'm just saying,
if you're, okay,
because I'm a citizen,
because let's deal with it.
Because I'm getting my master's paid for by the Army, by the United States Army. So, what is going to be for some of these people different? Their way of staying competitive in high school. Well, I'm going to college for free anyways.
Let me answer that in 2 respects. Number 1, and you asked the right questions. Nothing is free. All right. Mitch McConnell, President Trump want to give many, many, many hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 2%. How's that? Top 2% need that kind of help? Tell me. that been making them more competitive? Do you really think that's going to create jobs for working people? Do you think the very, very wealthiest need to get tax breaks when we cut back on after-school programs or Pell Grants? All right. So when you talk about being radical, the truth of the matter is you're right. If we are going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, that's a pretty expensive proposition, about $70 billion a year. Okay? Well, how are we going to pay for it? How come there was all kinds of money available for Wall Street when their greed and recklessness and illegal behavior nearly destroyed our economy? You know what they got in a bailout? They got $700 billion from the Treasury Department, not to mention all kinds of money from other sources, low-interest loans from the Fed. Do you think that it is appropriate, it's a good idea to give tax breaks to billionaires and not make sure that working-class kids can afford to go to college? Let me throw it back at you. Argue with me, kid.
I guess kind of like to redirect it, not to not answer that, but to redirect it. So are you saying implicitly that since the rich has been bailed out with like that $700 billion there, that they should be, are they going to be footing the bill for this funding of free tuition? So the top 1% or 2%
Actually,
is going
that's
to be
what,
paying for.
there are different
the
ways
rest
that
of
you
America.
can fund it, but that's the direction that I would in fact go. I would in fact put a tax on Wall Street speculation. That's how we fund making public colleges and universities tuition-free under my plan.
Would you mind if I insert my own
please.
personal experience? So, like you mentioned, I grew up in a blue-collar family. We faced a lot of economic challenges, and from a very young age, I was working alongside my dad. I can remember one job. My dad laid carpet, and that work is very hard. And I remember we got finished maybe 2 a.m. and my hands were so raw that I could not pick up my crystal hamburger because it burnt my fingers. In high school, that would have been amazing to be able to have a resume, to get a scholarship. But my resume was being a server at a local diner. And right after I finished my schoolwork, I went straight to work, and I worked there till 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and then went to school. I looked for scholarships. I didn't have anyone helping me. I had no time or anyone helping me to prepare for standardized tests like the ACT and SAT. But they tell poor kids, as long as you work really hard and get a good education, you can be anything you want to be. So I did work really hard. And I did get a good education. I got great grades at our local university, but I went on a Pell Grant. But this was during the Bush administration, and every year, funding for Pell Grants eroded. And by my senior year, I had to go hungry at the end of each month because I couldn't feed myself. And I was engaged at the time to my husband now, and I didn't even tell him that till a few years ago because I had such shame. And I thought I was the only person who would be in college and who couldn't feed themselves. So I wish that it was as simple as, they just need motivation to compete. And I'm sad that we have families and kids like me today that they don't even have the opportunity to do something that would make them competitive to go to college. It's real. I work at a junior high where we have a very high student population of free and reduced lunch kids, and their parents are working not just one shift, and so they're not there when their kids go to school in the morning, they're working 2. They're eating dinner at 11 p.m. at night when the mom can come home and go to the grocery store and get something to eat because they just got their check. Just the reality of real life when you have a low-wage job, it makes it impossible to compete.
Senator, any response?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for sharing what you just shared, because it's not easy. But what I know you know, and I know everybody knows, Dana's story is the story of many millions of families. I grew up in a family also that did not have a whole lot of money. And people don't want to talk about that. There's somehow this shame, supposedly. My father worked very, very hard, just never made a whole lot of money. I believe, especially when we have an economy which is undergoing radical change, all right? It is very hard to get a decent paying job now with a high school degree. Occasionally you can, often you can't. So forget even about human beings. Think about the future of this country. Do you know what? In Germany, every kid there who has the ability, not anybody, but you got to have the ability, will be able to go to college regardless of the income of their family. I think that sends a powerful message to every family in this country that if your kids study hard and they do well as Dana did, you know what? You are going to be able to make it into college. I want you to think about the future of our economy if other countries have a better educated workforce than we do. How are we going to compete? You tell me.
You know, at the turn of the 20th century, we were having a pitch discussion in our country about whether there should be free K-12 education at a public level. And there was a school of thought that said, why do we need this? Most folks are working on farms. But there was this thing going on in the Industrial Revolution, and there was a lot of movement into different jobs. And there was a group of leaders who said, you know what? In order to get a long-term edge, we've got to make sure that everybody, regardless of their station in life, can have access to a free high school education. And that decision was a linchpin for transforming the United States of America into a global superpower, because we were able to outperform people for decades. And now, you know, in my old job, I traveled a lot internationally, and Senator Sanders is correct that we are in the process of losing that edge. And I firmly believe, and getting back to your question, Gary, and getting back to you are a star, Dana. You are all stars around this table, and your courage is remarkable. But the one constant in life, my dad used to say to me in his very broken English, is change. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as a party and as a nation is help people adapt to change, because change is scary. I saw it in Buffalo. I was a kid when my dad died, and I watched my surrogate father, 10th grade educated, a Teamster, lose his job, lose his home, lose his dignity. And the union helped to stabilize his life. But if we don't have government helping, giving you access to affordable health care, that's not a handout. That is something that's enabling you to be self-sufficient. If we help give you access to that higher education, not necessarily a 4-year degree, but that certificate that the folks at BitSource got, that has enabled them to go on a different glide path to success, that's when I think we're at our best. And we have to make sure in every zip code we're providing that opportunity. Because I believe, we often talk about the cost of this, but the cost of doing nothing, I believe, is far more tragic, and I see it in too many places.
Let me just jump in, and then I'm going to throw this out to Wesley again, because sometimes I think we forget about Wesley. If we were a poor country, okay, Dana's experience would be common. That's the way it is there. We're living in a poor country. This is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And you know what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years? The people on top have become much, much wealthier. Middle class has shrunk, and 43 million people living in poverty, sometimes in desperate poverty. So the issue is not only an economic issue, it is a moral issue, all right? Let me throw one fact at you. In America today, the top 1/10 of 1%, owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Okay, and they want more. They want more tax breaks, and then they want to cut programs that impact, whether it's the Pell Grant program or nutrition programs, environmental programs. How are we comfortable with that from a moral perspective?
Tyler?
Well, I just had a question that goes back to Gary. Is how do we incentivize industries to come back to workforces like Eastern Kentucky? You know, there's not a whole lot of interstate system. How do we get ourselves as a state? How do we gear ourselves up to where they want to come to us? They see that there's a workforce. That's when, I mean, coal mining's hard work. I mean, they're blue-collar workers. These guys want to get out there and work, and if they didn't, they wouldn't do that job. How do we get those people to see that?
We spent a lot of time on that. Oh, go ahead, Gary.
No, I was just going to say, for example, there's the Reclaim Act, which is something that's been presented for over a year now. And now that it has finally got Mitch McConnell's sponsorship, he wants to change the bill so that it's not really at that grassroots level to improve the state of rural coal communities. So it's trying to find sustainable and diversified jobs so you're not relying on these market changes from these large corporations. I don't think that bringing in more factories would be the right idea. I think it's finding technology-based systems that broadband is a fairly low-cost infrastructure when you look at it compared to interstates and such. I think technology and then sustainable agriculture are the two biggest hopes for
Well, and Steve Beshear worked very hard on this issue when he was your governor, and I spent time down there, and it was bipartisan. Harold Rogers, who represents that part of the state and is a original sponsor of the Reclaim Act, was there, and that's what we were doing. You know, I think that it's so important to be honest with people, and I think opportunities do exist in Eastern Kentucky, but we've got to build the infrastructure, and its infrastructure is not just the physical infrastructure, it's the human capital infrastructure. And when you invest in people, the return is incredibly priceless. And they wanted to build, and they continue to want to build, I remember it vividly, we're building a Silicon Holler down in Eastern Kentucky. That's what we want to do down there. And I'll tell you, folks are resilient down there. And, you know, there's a lot of Garys in Eastern Kentucky. You talk to any employer about what are you looking for in your worker, and they'll tell you, I need to teach them certain skills for the job, but you know, I want someone who's got a work ethic. I want someone who knows what teamwork is about. I want someone who knows what elbow grease is about, who knows how to work under pressure, like you learned. You know what DEFCON 1 means, and that's what they want. And you have that in abundance in Kentucky. And what frustrates me is that your leadership right now is not investing in that. And the mission for us as a Democratic Party, and I would like to think that it's not just for Democrats, it's for everyone here in Kentucky, is to demonstrate that, folks, this is not a handout. This is not money that you're throwing away. This is investing in the future. We need to be like the folks at the turn of the 20th century who said, yes, we need to be forward thinking.
Thank you, Tom. So unfortunately, we have to come to the last question. Tanya, we're going to let you have the last question and then hear your response.
So we've been talking a lot about hardworking citizens of Kentucky, and we're not talking about some of the people who are invisible, that are working really tough jobs and working long hours. We're not talking about people who are undocumented. And a lot of our wealthiest people have a lot of undocumented people on their horse farms working. And so some of those people are the same people who don't want people to have a path to citizenship. And so I would ask, what is the vision for the Democratic Party to make sure that there are options for people who, I call them undocumentable, because they'd love to be documented?
Well, I'll tell you something which we haven't gone into. One of the things that demagogues do is, instead of addressing the real problems, creating good jobs, providing health care to all people, making sure that our kids are well educated. And we can all debate about the best way forward, but we all agree with those goals. Sometimes you gain political points. You know, you gain political points by turning one group of people against another group of people. Not just in America. This has gone all over the world. Okay, he's bad, I'm good, we gotta, you know, da-da-da. And people say, yeah, we really hate these people. What I worry very much about Trump and some of his friends is they're trying to divide us up. And one of their targets is the 11 million undocumented people in this country today. So what I believe is that we need immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, and a path towards citizenship. Right now, in my state of Vermont, small state, we have about 1,000 undocumented workers on our dairy farms. If they were expelled tomorrow, if they were deported, the entire dairy industry in Vermont, or a large part of it, would collapse. If you started deporting the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who work in agriculture in the United States, you know what happened to the price of food? It would double, it would triple, because those are the people who are growing our crops and picking the food that we eat. So I think what we have got to do is pass comprehensive immigration reform, which is pretty covers a lot more than undocumented workers, and provide over a period of time a path toward citizenship. But I certainly think that we cannot keep scapegoating those people for cheap political points.
You know, comprehensive immigration, I agree with 1,000% of what Senator Sanders just said. And I add this, comprehensive immigration reform historically has been a bipartisan issue. In 1986, Ronald Reagan led the charge. And I'll note parenthetically, in the aftermath of the passage of comprehensive immigration reform, President Reagan concluded that on certain levels in terms of family unification, it didn't go far enough. So through executive action, he extended protections to others. That was the ethic of the Republican presidency back then. 10 years later, I was working for Senator Kennedy. Comprehensive bipartisan immigration reform, coming together around that shared vision that we are indeed a nation of immigrants. We are also a nation of laws. And those two coexist and can coexist. And what's been remarkable to me as someone who has been involved in this issue my entire adult life is that it does bring together. It brings together faith leaders from conservative evangelical communities who understand the teachings of Leviticus. You know, treat the stranger among us. And folks on the progressive side who've always seen this. And business leaders. When I was in Alabama, they passed a law that was later overturned. And I met with business leaders there. And they were telling me all their farm products that had rotted because that law had scared the bejesus out of folks. And everybody lost in that. And so, you know, what excites me the most, and I leave with this, is the energy I see across America. We can continue to demand change. We can demand accountability. We can do so that's consistent with our values here. And the questions that you all are asking and the wisdom that you bring to the table inspires me to no end. And it makes me feel very optimistic about our nation's future.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Senator Sanders. And thank you, all of you, for participating in this. And thank you to our viewers for watching at home for the very lively conversation. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our viewers who are watching. We're very excited to be here in Kentucky with Senator Bernie Sanders and Tom Perez, and a really amazing group of folks from all over the state of Kentucky.